Hello BookTube, it's Amy. I'm back with Orcutt's The Kingdom of Books, and this is sort of take two with the next chapter here called The Book in Full Dress. I read this chapter aloud on Friday and had prepared to post it on Sunday, but shortly before it was supposed to post, I took a look at it, and curiously it was 8 minutes long. Somehow after I uploaded it, only the last 8 minutes ended up sticking, and at that point I had already deleted the file off my phone, and so I couldn't give it a second try, so that was deleted, and I'll give this a second try. Hopefully it works this time. This chapter is called The Book in Full Dress. The effort of William Morris to procure harmony between the illustration and the printed page, remarked my old friend Marion H. Spielman one day 30 years ago, has resulted merely in the production of beautiful books on a line notoriously inadequate for the needs of the present day. This flat statement from so eminent an authority as the editor of the English Magazine of Art came to me in the nature of a shock. When 5 years earlier I had been trying to grasp the basic principles of bookmaking, no one had even suggested to me that a knowledge of the interrelationship between decoration and types was essential. This did not enter into the old line conception of the printer's province. Yet what could be more obvious? At the various presses of that time might be found motley collections of woodcuts and line plates. There were initial letters, headpieces and tailpieces, Maltese, Latin or Greek crosses, wreaths and festoons, floating angels and the like, all left over from volumes that had been printed in the dim and distant past. Occasionally a more modern border or ornament was selected and ordered from the stock designs of the type founder's specimen book. On the slightest provocation, and with apparently no consideration of its relation to the type, some of these awful symbols of barbarism were slipped in on a title page or to fill in the blank space at the beginning and end of chapters, which it seemed to me the God of the book surely intended for higher purposes. What those higher purposes were, I did not then know. I was simply aware that I sensed a definite lack of something in most of the examples where illustration and decoration were combined, with type pages issuing at that time from even the best-known bookmaking establishments. Then the glory of the Kelmscott volumes burst upon the world, and in a goodly company of other book lovers, I reveled in this manifestation of what modern decoration could be made to mean. A suggestion that these masterpieces were inadequate from one in whose judgment I felt such supreme confidence as I did Marion Spielman's seemed almost sacrilegious. My friend must have seen the effect upon me, for he was quick to add to what he had already said. Don't misunderstand me. Of course, I admire the Morris volumes, but, according to my definition, they are not really books at all. A book is primarily intended to be read, and any features in illustration or decoration, in ornament, page, or page arrangement, that obviously conspire against the reading of the book or the concentration of the reader are wrong in art and indefensible in practice. Revivalism is all very well, but to be living, an art must be the outcome of present-day needs, not of past-day limitations. It does not follow that we may not base our work upon the work of the past, but it must be a modern rendering, not an imitation or a mere adaptation of what, after all, was modern enough in the 15th century. And we have here an illustration with stock decorations of the 1890s, a page from the specimen book of a famous American press of the period. And some of these do look slightly familiar to me. Now, it's possible that I've seen these specific ones in a book somewhere, but it's also probably even more likely that I've just seen similar ones, as I'm sure there were many similar variations of the popular decorations of the period. Special books, no doubt, and special purposes justify exceptional revivals, but the habitual printing of modern books by the great presses in a medieval fashion in order to satisfy a love of the antique would be as reasonable as to print Pickwick in Chaucerian language and spelling, in order to please modern lovers of Sesquento art. This experience was what first beguiled me into my adventure among illustrations and decorations. I was determined to place myself in a position where I might know why I liked or disliked, and thus gain the added pleasure that comes with even limited appreciation. I soon discovered how close the relationship between the art of the illustrator and the art of printing really is. Gradually, the scope of the co-relation expanded, and increased knowledge concerning the one gave me a better understanding of the other. In coming into full accord with Spielmann's estimate of the Kelmscott volumes, I lost none of my pleasure in their beauty because of a different classification of their genus. Had any doubt as to the keenness of Spielmann's constructive criticism remained, the flood of sham Kelmscotts that resulted from the Morris revival would have proved a justification. For in copying a wonderfully fine thing of its kind, the imitators seized upon the inconsistencies of style, and in their lack of understanding, emphasized them. The importance to me of this chance conversation with Spielmann was the revelation it gave that if a printer was to produce well-made illustrated volumes, it was as essential for him to become conversant with the history and precedent of decoration as to know his types. The fact that this was not generally recognized at the time explained the lack of appeal in most books of this nature. I do not mean by this that there were no handsomely decorated or illustrated books issued during this period, but I observed that such volumes were the result of the artist's cooperation with the printer rather than the reverse. I remember a charming edition of Drake's Culprit Fay, where type and decoration are splendidly combined. But the credit for this belongs to Edmund H. Garrett, the artist who drew his illustrations after the type page had been determined. Another excellent example is Cable's Old Creole Days, in which Albert Herder's beautiful illustrative decorations, reproduced by the most exacting process of photogravure, were effectively combined with type. And here again the artist planned the page and laid out the scheme. Herder went back to the old volumes where the decorative artist combined illustration with ornamentation. While many of the early designs might seem to be illustrations, their use for the purpose of giving information was a later but a natural development. The first initial letters, the headpieces and tailpieces, the borders, conveyed no suggestion to the reader of the nature of the subject matter. But in some of the illuminated manuscript volumes, such as Queen Mary's Psalter of the 14th century, the decorations began to take on illustrative form, and the early printed volumes soon followed suit. The descriptive text of books on scientific subjects was supplemented by crude explanatory drawings. Title pages began to combine illustration with decoration. Out of all this came the modern practice of using decoration and illustration primarily for information, as seen in many of the advertising brochures produced today. Just as the Salvation Army uses the brass band to attract its audience, so is supremely beautiful ornamentation employed to attract the eye, hoping to hold it long enough to get the commercial message across. Modern printing expresses itself as an art far more consistently in the advertising brochure than in the book. A corporation does not figure the cost of the artist or the engraver when it sets out to produce an effect, whereas a publisher must. While Will Bradley was in my University Press studio at Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Century magazine gave him a commission to design the cover for their Christmas issue. A tobacco company whose advertisement was to appear on the back cover also gave him the order to design their page, that the cover might be kept harmonious as a whole. Bradley received an honorarium of $250 for the front design and rendered a bill of $1,250 for the back, this representing the difference between art and commerce. The Bradley Vogue in America, about 1905, resulted in a mortifying experience for me. A well-known firm of New York clothiers gave Bradley a free hand in designing their advertising material. A part of this was a brochure entitled Things Clerical, the exploiting, as its title suggests, wearing apparel for the clergy. On the first page, the title line was designed in beautiful letters, the rest of the page being covered by an elaborate decorative design. The first sheet off the press was sent to New York on receipt of which the clients telegraphed to stop the work until their publicity man could arrive in Boston. I met him at the station early the next morning, and we took our breakfast together. At last we came to the occasion of the conference. Drawing the folded sheet from his bag, he held it before me and pointed to the first page. Will you kindly tell me what possible significance that design has in connection with the subject matter of this pamphlet? He demanded. Frankly, I had given the matter no previous thought, as the artistic layout had been left wholly in Bradley's hands. But some reply had to be made. I haven't heard Bradley say what he had in mind, I admitted rather lamely. But I suppose the design is meant to suggest the chancel rail always found in front of the altar in Episcopalian churches. Why, of course, my friendly critic exclaimed after a moment's consideration. How stupid of me. I see it clearly now. I'll go right back to New York, and you go ahead with the printing. When I returned to my office, I sent for Bradley and asked him the same question that had been put to me. And this is just a pause to show you what this cover illustration looks like. And frankly, I don't see it at all for what he thought it was and what it's revealed as on the next page. Why don't you recognize it? He exclaimed, obviously hurt. It is the motif of the Holy Grail. There are 2 volumes I keep in my library because they seem to be successful echoes of the Morris books. And the reason they were successful is that their designers made original applications of the Morris principles instead of merely copying them. One of these is Fringilla, which also shows the influence of Aubrey Beardsley, designed by Will Bradley, and the other is Esther, decorative borders and initial letters by Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue. Both these books were planned by the artists, but the latter also shows the discriminating taste of the late Frederick H. Day, who, during his brief career as a book designer as well as publisher, demonstrated his artistic sense in several other volumes, which must always rank high in the history of American bookmaking. I like to compare Esther with The Wood Beyond the World of William Morris. The latter has the advantage of the specially designed Chaucer type, while the former is composed in the standard old-style antique. I like this book the best of Morris's lesser publications, because, being himself the author, he rewrote the text to fit the type, and was thus relieved of the necessity of using the leaf florets. He frequently employed to space out his lines without breaking the word. I had already seen the printer coming into his own and forcing recognition of himself as the proper expert to determine the correct use and combination of his types. Now I found him face to face with the same situation in the manner of the decorated book. Few of even the best artists possess more than a superficial knowledge of types, and most are notoriously poor letterers. In the example already mentioned of old Creole days, Albert Herder's letters are neither in keeping with the type nor with the decorations themselves. The printer in those days would have considered it an impertinence on his part to criticize them, yet he should have done so. Of those artists who have contributed to books, Joseph Pennell seems to me to have mastered most successfully the correlation between type and decoration. Yet his pet aversion to the fractional line at the end of the paragraph, as carried to the extreme in his own Adventures of an Illustrator, results in a type page too solid to be agreeable to the reader, who finds relief in the natural breaks in the type mass. Other artists have produced work that corresponds in line and is in perfect harmony with the type. Others have made drawings which successfully conveyed their messages, but when a Pennell design is combined with a carefully thought-out type page, I always feel that the decoration has not only gained added expression from the correctness of its surrounding letters, but that it has also given additional significance to the feeling of the type itself. Joseph Pennell would have made a wonderful typographer had he turned his art in that direction. And we have a few examples here, an American expression of Aubrey Beardsley, and these are examples of the Morris style. Quite lovely. As I thought the matter over, I became convinced that the ideal result could only be secured by having an illustrated book dominated either by an artist who also possessed a real knowledge of type, or by a printer who also possessed a real knowledge of decoration. With this in mind, I studied the principles employed by the early makers of books, in which the arts of decoration and printing were so successfully combined. From the very beginning, the pitfalls were only too apparent. In fields of art, other than that of printing, the imagination of the artist is stimulated by the subject itself, and in some branches she is distinctly aided by color or form. But when it comes to the art of the book, the refinement and beauty of the printed page and its subtle shadings has to depend wholly upon the abstract feeling of the artist-printer. When decoration is combined with type, the test of the printer's artistic sense is that much more exacting. I was delighted to find that the adventure took me back into familiar fields. Again, I found myself mingling with the worthies of the book of the 15th century, who sought to preserve art and extend learning at the same time. The desire for decoration, of course, goes back at least as far as the cave dwellers, where it may have found expression in a wild flower fastened to a woman's hair, or in a few extra scratches made upon the stone that form the medium of communication. At all events, the desire has always been a natural one, its genesis being the innate human craving for adornment. When manuscripts began to be transcribed, the beauty of the thought was supplemented by the beauty of the hand letter and the accompanying illumination. In the printed book, the same effort was made, through the design of type or decoration, to hold the vehicle of thought in keeping with the thought itself. The whole idea of decorating a printed book was an echo from the handwritten volume, and just as the early scribe cooperated with the illuminator by leaving blank spaces for the initial letters and ample margins for the major illuminations, so did the early printer seek to enhance the beauty of his own printing by offering the decorative artist an opportunity to display his skill. At the British Museum, I found a most interesting relic. In a volume printed by Peter Schoeffer in 1471, the artist was well on his way to give the first page a sumptuous treatment when, for some reason, he stopped. The borders and the illustrative headpiece are sketched in with pencil, the heavy rules and backgrounds being overlaid with a creamy pigment on which the gold leaf was to have been added. Even in its unfinished state, it gives evidence that the artist possessed uncommon skill. In many of the illuminated printed volumes I have studied, the design of the type is so close to the hand letter and the presswork is so excellent that it requires the most careful scrutiny to distinguish them from embellished manuscripts. Against these and the partially completed copy just mentioned, there are other examples which tell a different story. It was, of course, optional with 15th century book buyers as to just what form this decoration should take, and the very large number of cradle books which have come down to us with the blank spaces still unfilled stand as mute evidence of a splendid idea that went wrong. It was at this point that the advancement of the new invention of printing seemed doomed to interruption. The decoration of books was absolutely demanded by those who bought them. The theory of the early printers who embellished could be added to the printing. The theory of the early printers that embellishment could be added to the printed page by hand was sound enough, but when it came to practice, the cost was too great for most of them who wished to secure the gem of thought in its new and less expensive form. Well, for those who could afford the luxury of the hand illumination, the printed book was not thought to compare in any way with the glory of the handwritten volume. Just at this crisis, the art of woodcutting came to its assistance. The close relationship of this art to the art of printing is so apparent that it is 1,000 pities the two ever had to be divorced. In typography, the impression is taken from a raised surface of metal, in the woodcut from a raised surface of wood, and the similarity of method makes them natural kinsmen. The art of woodcutting, like the art of printing, was an art of the people. It was practiced in Germany and the Netherlands a quarter of a century before books came to be printed from movable types. Sometimes it expressed itself in woodcuts without letterpress, as in the St. Christopher of 1423, now in the John Rylands Library. Sometimes in woodcut pictures and woodcut text, as in the Ars Moriendi and other block books. In these volumes, the letters were laboriously cut by hand on a single piece of wood, and if a single error was made, it was necessary to discard the entire page block. The leaves were printed on one side of the sheet only, the paper being pressed into the face of the block by rubbing it on the back with a burnisher. These curious examples, more interesting than beautiful, used to be given dates earlier than 1460, and were considered as forerunners of the invention of printing. But Alfred W. Pollard has pointed out the utter lack of evidence to confirm these dates, and advances the still more interesting theory that the early printers employed woodcutting for short, popular publications, requiring frequent reprinting as a forerunner of stereotyping or electrotyping. The next step in the evolution was to combine woodcut decorations and illustrations with text printed from movable type. The early artists who drew and then cut their designs on wooden blocks were forerunners of the early printers, at least so far as their effort consisted in conveying a message to the masses through the reproduction of old Bible legends and pictorial representation of popular questions, which later was expressed in printed word. These publications exerted tremendous influence, at first in serving religious purposes and later being used to attack the church through satirical presentation of the clergy. Beyond this, they preserve valuable records of the customs, the costumes, and the manners of their period. The limitations of this method are obvious. It soon became apparent that if confined to block books and block printing, the art of woodcutting would never find scope enough to achieve permanence. So the two arts, each gasping for breath, joined forces. The wood blocks replaced the work of the engrosser and illuminator in the initial letters and in the ornamentation, which combined with the type in producing beautiful pages, and by their union established the printed book in so impregnable a position that further opposition by the patrons of the handwritten volume was hopeless. At first, the blank space left by the printer for the initial and the expanse of white margin were decorated by means of woodcut blocks, which were stamped on by hand and then colored by the illuminator. The very rare Grenville copy of Virgil at the British Museum is an excellent example of this phase, as I know. The impression of the woodcut blocks used for the initial letter and the marginal decoration look as if put on with rubber stamps, but had the artist completed his work in colors and gold, the imperfections would have been concealed. I've seen many finished examples where it is difficult to discover the underlying design. In some cases, the initials do not fit the space left for them, which must have been the origin of the present sloppy practice of using initial letters that are too short for the space they occupy. Half a line too much blank below an initial ruins the appearance of many an otherwise well-conceived page. This matter of stamping and coloring, while less expensive than the fully illuminated printed volumes, was still too costly to be practical. So the next step was the natural one of combining the woodcut decorations with the type and printing them together upon the press. Even now, the love of color and gold held for a time. There are examples where the owners of volumes thus printed turned them over to the illuminator to embellish. But as the decorations came to be well printed and book lovers realized that the two arts were at last successfully combined, the artist-decorator began gradually to retire from the making of the book. Thus this art of woodcutting, this new ally, liberated the art of printing from its dependence upon miniature painters and illuminators. The initial letters of richly decorative design were now cut on blocks of wood, and then combined with the type with no attempt to cover them with color, but depending upon their own beauty to enhance the attractiveness of the printed page. Frontispieces were added, and even the margins were decorated with ornamentation fashioned along the line of the more elaborate and more costly hand illumination. What appealed to me particularly was that the early artists recognized the early printers as men of learning, and in subordinating themselves, paid a tribute to the printer's superior knowledge. So long as printing remained an art well into the 16th century, there was a definite respect for the relation of the decoration of the type. 15th century printers used Gothic fonts more frequently than Roman, and the artist who designed the decoration kept in mind the heavy black of the typeface. The volumes of Erhard Ratelt, printed in Venice around 1470, offer an admirable example of borders and initial letters which combine perfectly with the type and with each other. The artist supposed to be Giovanni Bellini, who designed the initial letters and illustrations for the Hypertomachia Polifi, printed by Ellis in Venice in 1499, kept his line light to correspond with the type, with the result that the decorations are as much an integral part of the printed page as the type itself. A recent edition of the Rubaiyat, printed by Jonick Kibbe and Company in San Francisco, shows admirable consideration of this correlation. Modern printers have not always been so scrupulous in preserving the harmony of the page. They have taken these heavy-faced blocks out of their proper environment and have combined them with the lighter Roman faces so that the decoration absolutely overwhelms the type. During the 16th century, such supreme artists as Dürer and Holbein used the woodcut as the medium for expressing their genius and carried it to its highest point. The latter's Dance of Death has long been a classic, and the editions containing these reminders, even to the mightiest, that death is no respecter of persons, are literally without number. By the middle of the 16th century, copperplate engravings appeared, and proved so popular that for approximately 2 centuries, the woodcut was relegated to use in chapbooks and other popular publications. Some of the copperplate titles are so beautiful in themselves that at first the book lover does not realize their incongruity. The Plantin press maintained the quality of its typography and presswork, enough to prevent the handiwork of Rubens from appearing too much out of place. But could anything call attention more loudly to the inferiority of the manufacture of many of the Elsevier volumes than the carefully designed copperplate titles? Towards the end of the 18th century, woodcutting returned to the book under the guidance of Thomas Bewick in England, in the form of wood engravings. The woodcutter of the Middle Ages cut his designs with knives in the wood of the pear or the apple tree. Bewick supplied the modern woodcutter with engraver's tools, made an engraver out of him, and secured superb effects through the contrast in light and shade. It proved to be more than a mere revival, for the transformation from woodcutting to wood engraving introduced new methods which proved exceedingly popular. The introduction of illustrations in periodicals about 1830 added a farther impetus. I turn to my Cruikshank and my Phiz illustrations of more recent dates and sincerely regret that this form of book decoration has passed away. And here we have an illustration. Woodcutting becomes wood engraving, a Bewick plate from Fables, 1818. In 1860, zinc etchings had been produced simultaneously in Vienna and Paris, demonstrating that pen and ink drawings could be transferred to zinc and etched into acids much less laboriously than they could be engraved on wood. During the 1870s, photography lent its aid to reproduction, and the photomechanical process called photo engraving came into existence. Long after pen and ink illustration asserted itself as a distinct art, mechanical design still held close to the old woodcut model. The next step on the part of the photo engraver was naturally in the direction of the photograph itself, and this led to the evolution of the halftone process. The word halftone, through familiar use, has come to be simply the name of a certain method of pictorial reproduction, without conveying any specific indication of what it really is. Without going too deeply into the technical details, I found it useful to know that a halftone reproduction is made by photography through a screen of opaque, evenly spaced lines, either parallel or crossing, forming transparent apertures through which the image is reformed. In the photographic operation of making a halftone negative, the screen is placed slightly in front of the sensitive plate. This space, known as screen distance, permits dispersion and diffraction of the light rays, so as to create lines or dots which vary in size according to the intensity of the light reflected from the original, even though photographed through a screen having apertures uniform in size. The halftone plate itself was the successful result of a natural desire to translate a photograph into some medium that could be printed upon a press. My first introduction to it in 1891, when I began my service to the book at the Old University Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I well remember the pride that famous institution took in the fact that the first cylinder press in America was set up within its walls, which gave the establishment its early prestige in producing the finest results in printing illustrative plates. In 1868, A.K.P. Welch of the firm of Welch, Bigelow and Company, John Wilson's predecessors as proprietors of the University Press, went to France for the purpose of inspecting a new press which the French ingenuity had produced. Up to that time, such volume as Whittier's Snowbound, 1865, containing beautiful woodcuts had been printed on hand presses. The cylinder press differs from the old Adams or flatbed press in that the paper is fed to the type from a cylinder, with only one point of contact from the type to the paper at the moment the two touch each other, while the action of the flatbed press forces the entire form of type into the paper at the same impression. Rumors of what the cylinder press would do made Mr. Welch eager to secure the new invention to use particularly in printing the magazine. Every Saturday for J.R. Osgood and Company of Boston, he brought this model back with him. The original press was later sold to a Boston printer and was destroyed in the Boston Fire of 1872. By the time I entered the university press, the revolution in printing machinery caused by this exploit had been accomplished. Cylinder presses of American manufacture were in all the leading press rooms, and hand presses had been relegated to oblivion. The new art of photo engraving had replaced the art of wood engraving, the first experiment at the university press having been successfully made in an issue of the Harvard Lampoon in 1873. A.W. Drake of the Century Company, about 1881, in cooperation with Theodore L. Devine, took another dramatic step when he persuaded S.D. Warren and Company of Boston to produce a sheet with an artificial chalk surface, at first called fine-cut paper. The Warren Company have a copy of the Century magazine of December 1887, which contains one 4-page and 3 16-page inserts of woodcuts printed on what today we would call coated paper, and the appearance of these illustrations is striking when compared with the woodcuts and the 2 halftones that are printed in the advertising section upon uncoated stock. The importance of the medium upon which to print was again forcefully emphasized. I have tried in vain to satisfy myself as to who really invented the halftone. The claimants to that honor are many, and each produces at least plausible evidence. As a matter of fact, the invention is undoubtedly a composite achievement to which several have contributed. However this may be, I found the new story told to me by the veteran Stephen H. Horgan of New York of his participation in the early experiments of intense interest. It seems that fugitive attempts to translate a photograph into a printing plate had been made as early as 1852, but it was not until 1880 that a halftone was actually made which could be printed upon a press. One evening after dinner, together at a club nearby, Mr. Horgan took me to the New York Public Library, and together we turned the leaves of an old file of the New York Daily Graphic. When we came to the birthday issue of March 4th, 1880, a double-page spread was shown, combining 14 different methods of pictorial reproduction of the day, one of which includes the now famous print entitled Shantytown. It was with no little pride that Mr. Horgan pointed to this and said, "This is the first actual reproduction direct from nature ever printed on a press, and I made it." In the editorial columns of the same issue I found the following interesting note. "We have dealt heretofore with the pictures made with drawings or engravings. Here we have one direct from nature. Our photographers made the plate from which this picture has been obtained in the immediate presence of the shanties which are shown in it. There has been no redrawing of the picture. The transfer print has been obtained direct from the original negative. As will be seen, certain of the effects are obtained by the use of vertical lines. This process has not yet been fully developed. We are still experimenting with it and feel confident that our experiments will in the long run result in success and that pictures will eventually be regularly printed in our pages, direct from photographs without the intervention of drawing." How modest this prediction now seems, in view of the domination the halftone has assumed in all branches of the graphic arts. It has revolutionized methods of paper making and ink making. It has entirely altered the construction of presses. It is responsible for the incredible circulation of newspapers and magazines. The halftone was just coming into general use in book printing offices in 1891, and I well remember the hostility shown by the pressmen to the crazy innovation. Mr. Horgan was at that time art director of the New York Herald, and in 1893 he wrote James Gordon Bennett that he could make a halftone plate which could be printed in the paper. Mr. Bennett sent this letter to the superintendent of his press room for an opinion, and received a reply which suggested that any man who believed that a halftone could be printed on a fast-running daily newspaper press was absolutely out of his mind. As a result of this, Mr. Horgan lost his position on the Herald, but later he took his idea to Whitelaw Reid on the New York Tribune, and there accomplished what had been declared to be an impossibility. Royal Cortizo, at that time art critic and literary editor of the Tribune, describes the event. "I was helpless in the matter of showing what an artist's picture was like unless I could first persuade him to make a pen drawing of it. Photographs were used only as a basis for pen drawings. Pure black and white was our only illustrative wear. But at this time, Stephen H. Horgan was interesting itself in the question of handling the halftone in such wise that it could be printed from the curved stereotype plate of a newspaper. They began with a photograph of the late Thomas C. Platt, just then elected to the United States Senate. It was successfully reproduced in halftone in the Tribune of January 21st, 1897, and during the following years in which Mr. Horgan was art director of the paper, he carried the process farther and farther, making a substantial contribution toward the universal adoption of the halftone as a means of newspaper illustration. Mr. Horgan told me an amusing story of an experience he had with Sir Hubert Herkomer in 1891, at which time he was completing his invention of intaglio engravings from line drawings. Herkomer had come to America to paint portraits of American celebrities, and he had learned from various artists that Horgan had a method of photographing a drawing on metal in wax, so that an artist could etch it. Herkomer's inquiring and receptive mind demanded proof of the seemingly incredible feat. "If I make a drawing of you now," asked Herkomer, "could you photograph it on metal?" Receiving an affirmative reply, Herkomer made a drawing of Horgan in his working apron on ordinary writing paper. This was photographed on zinc and brought to the artist master. "How much would I have to pay to see how you do it?" he demanded. Horgan smiled and named what he thought would be a prohibitive sum, but the artist drew from his pocket a small checkbook and immediately wrote a check for the amount mentioned. Sworn to secrecy, he watched Horgan carry through his process and significantly remarked, "I never spent $500 that was of so much benefit to me." Since then, the art of photo engraving has developed by leaps and bounds, and the genius that had conducted it now mechanically reproduces the copy set before the camera with a fidelity that is extraordinary. From its very nature, the present halftone plate, although effective in full-page inserts, was never suitable to be combined directly with type. With other methods of reproduction, the illustrations have been made to harmonize with the type. With the halftone, the type has to be harmonized with the illustration. And to do this, the ever-present handicap of the highly surfaced paper must be overcome. The halftone is not what its name implies, but it is an aggregation of many tones. Type, on the other hand, being printed in but one tone, must be so arranged as to call upon the white spaces of the page, in shape and distribution, to harmonize with the intermediate grays of the halftone plate. No simple undertaking, this. The halftone plate has won for itself a triumph unequaled by any of the preceding processes, yet I venture to predict that within another decade its use will be confined almost entirely to newspapers. I firmly believe that for books, for the highest grade of advertising brochures, and even for magazines, the halftone with its screen over even the lightest tones will be replaced by the highlight halftone, from which the screen is eliminated, where tones occur which are as light as the paper on which it is printed. Difficulties in presswork are largely simplified by the elimination of this seemingly useless screen area, and a highlight halftone plate can be printed on paper freed from the artificial chalk surface, and thus come closer to coordinating with the type. The highlight plate has, I believe, opened up a new era by preserving the value of the ingenious invention of the halftone, while eliminating the inartistic elements of translating photographic reproduction into a medium to be multiplied upon the printing press. I have no doubt laid myself open to the charge of being mid-Victorian and standing as a champion of woodcuts, which have become a lost art of expression. But I insist that my appreciation of the value and importance of the halftone is by no means lessened by my feeling that the newer invention has been misused, sadly. That it has its place in the graphic art is indisputable. That it has contributed vastly to the advance of the graphic arts is beyond question. Perhaps my old-fashioned fondness for the woodcut is a bit intensified by my admiration for the superb examples of the art preserved in the work of Timothy Cole. Only recently I put one of Timothy Cole's reproductions of a masterpiece against a halftone plate I had previously admired of the same subject, and I became promptly aware that I had permitted myself to be content with something which, in spite of the ingenuity of its maker, absolutely lacked the vitality and individuality of the art which it had supplanted. How could it be otherwise? No photograph can translate the value of a picture without absolute precision, nor can it convey to him who looks the true message of the artist. When I study a wood engraving by such a master as Timothy Cole, I feel that I am in actual touch with the artist himself. It is one artist being interpreted by another, A camera cannot interpret, for it possesses no understanding. I wonder if we should attach any significance to the fact that during the last decade, illustrations have practically disappeared from novels, while newspapers have come into existence with phenomenal circulations, which convey the news to their clientele almost entirely through the medium of halftone pictures. Of course, the cinema has taught people to absorb stories through their eyes instead of through their minds, and perhaps to assimilate the daily news in like manner is a natural sequence. But the whole movement would seem to be retrogressive, back to the time when people had to gain information from pictorial design because they could not read, or because books were too rare or too expensive to be commonly possessed. The disappearance of illustrations from novels has been a boon from the standpoint of the author. He draws the picture of his characters not by description, but bit by bit as the story progresses, intending that his reader shall visualize them as if in life, rather than as photographic studies. Rarely does the artist absorb this characterization even as well as the average reader. He seizes upon some incident in the story and develops an excellent sketch of the characters as they rest in his own mind, instead of interpreting to the reader real portraits of personalities, such as the author has carefully endeavored to create. Most authors feel that it is far better to leave the fate of the recreation of the limitation to the casual reader than to the mercy of the illustrator. And even with a sympathetic artist, the reproduction of the design has to be the photomechanical halftone instead of the more living art of the wood engraver. Since the elimination of illustrations in works of fiction, the desire on the part of the public for decoration has been gratified by the universal custom of using a highly decorative jacket. This also has a practical appeal. Each volume on the bookseller's counter is in competition with dozens of others lying beside it. If the prospective buyer can be attracted to pick up a particular volume and glance it over, the chances of its sales are much more enhanced. During the run of one of my novels some years ago, and before the era of decorated jackets, I chanced to go to the newsstands in a New York hotel to purchase some theater tickets. Placed conspicuously on the counter, I noticed copies of my story. The clerk with whom I chatted about the tickets was affable and confidential. "You're the fella who wrote that book, aren't you?" he demanded, associating the name I gave him for the tickets with that on the cover of the volume. Acknowledging the accusation, I asked the bromidic question, "How is it going?" "Oh, it's selling all right," he replied, "but you fellows don't know how to make books that will sell. You ought to put a pretty picture of a girl on the jacket. That's what'll do it. It don't make a bit of difference what's on the inside of a book." Since then, the trend of the decorative jacket has proved the clerk to have possessed the full power of prophecy and divination. My adventures among the decorated books of all ages, covering so many years, have increased my respect for artist or printer who realizes the intrinsic value of restraint. I have learned that the ornamentation or the illustration should either be fully capable to stand by itself without the explanatory cooperation of type, or that it should modestly merge its own individuality by becoming an ally of the type in conveying the message of the printed page. If an ally, then the decoration must take its motif from the type, for from the standpoint of the book, typography is the dominating art. Again, I find myself turning to Coben Sanderson's ideal book, this time not to revel in the balance of its physical format, but to take from it, as from the notes of a master, the text which his disciples must always respect. The ideal book is a composite thing made up of many parts, and may be made beautiful by the beauty of each of its parts, in subordination to the whole, which collectively they constitute. On the other hand, each contributory part may usurp the functions of the rest and of the whole, and growing beautifully beyond all bounds, ruin for its own common cause. So that is the end of that chapter. The next one here, which I will likely return with tomorrow, is called The Clothing of Books, which is a very fascinating chapter on book bindings. And it's got some wonderful illustrations that I can't wait to show off here.